Good evening, everybody, and thank you once again for joining us here in this edition of the monthly Market Insight. We are now at March 12th, and it's coming up to almost a year since we actually went into a lockdown. It's obviously been a very unusual and a very unique year. The thing that perhaps most people would have least expected a year ago, if you had told them that we were going into a full scale lockdown for 3 to 4 months and that we would exit the lockdown very gradually, perhaps very few people would have expected that the market would actually have rallied. Obviously, it's come as a surprise to all of us. But at the same time, I think there are multiple reasons. We've talked about this in the past, the actions of governments and central banks across the world to provide liquidity to markets, to provide income support and credit support to citizens. And last, but perhaps most importantly, the wonderful work done by scientists and medicine professionals all over the world, many of them who worked at a very rapid pace to get the vaccines out there. We just crossed 2 crore people vaccinated in India earlier this week. That's a remarkable number, and we look forward to seeing more and more people getting vaccinated and gradually life returning to some semblance of how it used to be, the way it was almost in early March 2020. So that's where we currently stand almost a year into this. So what we are going to do today, much like we've always done in all our previous sessions, is first start off with a presentation. The presentation will cover the areas that we normally do, which is where are we in terms of earnings, where are we in terms of valuations. And as usual, we always incorporate something which is topical. So this time we are going to be talking about two topical elements. One, the nature of capital expenditure in India, and second, about a more recent phenomenon, which is really about the fact that bond yields have been spiking in India and all over the world as well. So just bear with me a minute, and I'm going to pull up the presentation now. So just hold on a second. We should be underway soon. Great. So here we are, Market Insight, March 2021. This is what the markets have done over the last 1 month, 3 months, and 1 year. I won't spend too much time on this, but I think clearly the budget, which was presented on February 1, we discussed the budget in our previous call in February, but that certainly gave the markets a boost of confidence because of the language that government spoke in terms of tax stability, in terms of keeping the fiscal stimulus in place, and also the promise of privatization. And you can see how that's played out over a 1 month period. Small caps doing best, followed by mid caps, and then the Nifty 50 actually bringing up the rear. So very much, a risk on sense in the marketplace, and that's what is reflected in the way markets have behaved over the past 1 month. Also, interestingly, when you come down to the 1 month performance, when it comes to sectors, you'll see that the best performing index has been the PSU Bank Index, again, led from the front by the largest bank in the country, but also a lot of excitement related to potential privatization. But of course, when you look at the 1 year performance, you'll find that the Nifty Bank PSU is not really among the top performers. It's actually some of the more globally oriented sectors which have actually had the strongest performances. One is metals, followed by IT and pharmaceutical. Metals essentially driven by the sharp rise that we've seen in commodity prices, particularly I would say over the last 6 months. partly because of a weak dollar, and increasingly because of the fact that people are looking at the continued extent of significant fiscal support that is being made available, particularly in the US, where just this week we had a $2 trillion or $1.9 trillion to be precise fiscal package, which was approved by the Senate. So moving on from that to market performance, again, you can see over there on a 1 month basis, India was among the best performing markets, I think reflecting a lot to do with the positive sentiment out of the budget. Interestingly, actually, over the last 30, 40 days, there's been quite a bit of weakness, particularly in markets like China. Also, the US market in the more technology dominated section. In fact, as of yesterday morning, the Nasdaq was down almost 10% from its all-time high in January. And in China, the China Technology Index was down almost 20% from its recent high at the low point yesterday. So there has been some rotation in the marketplace and also a significant correction which has taken place in the technology side. Our markets really don't have too much of internet technology stocks, and therefore we've been sort of untouched, and the positive sentiment from the budget has played a significant role. So where are we in terms of earnings? And I would just draw your attention to the right side of this chart, where you can see the actual EPS numbers for the Nifty for March 20, for March 21, and also March 22. Now, the most remarkable thing here is that the current analyst estimate is that earnings for March 21 will actually be higher than March 20 by almost about 8%. If we go back in time, and you'll see some of this on the next slide, by the end of April 2020, the expectation was that March 21 earnings would actually decline 8 to 10% for the Nifty. So the fiscal, monetary, and the quick sort of normalization which has happened in the economy has driven this outcome, where the Nifty earnings are now expected to be in positive territory for the year, reflecting a lot of the benefits which have accrued to the formal sector, and the listed companies, and particularly the Nifty 50 companies, are nothing if not formal and some of India's largest enterprises, and they are reflecting that benefit with positive earnings growth this year, despite a revenue decline. And of course, the forecast for March 22 is 33% earnings growth to a index EPS of 705. This is as per the Bloomberg consensus. Here is the data in terms of how consensus earnings have behaved. Look at the right side of that chart again, the bottom blue line. And you can see by April 20, that blue line had dropped to below 500. At the worst point in November, it had actually dropped closer to 450, 460, which was an earnings decline, as I said, of about 7 or 8% expectation. But now we have finished at, or rather now we are estimating 530, which is actually an improvement from the previous year's final EPS, which was 485. So the consensus now expects almost 30% plus earnings growth in FY22, which is March 22, followed by a further almost 17-18% earnings growth in FY23. So this dramatic U-turn in consensus estimates is partly one of the things that has fed into the positive trajectory that markets have experienced. So let's move on from this to look at valuations. I've said this many times, and therefore I'm going to rush through the next two slides. There's no point looking at the trailing PE multiple, because this includes the quarter where we were in lockdown. Having said that, I do believe the forward PE is now material, because we are now presuming FY22 to be a normal operating year. And when you look at the forward PE now, it reflects what we believe will be a normal year. Having said that, the valuations have moved into expensive territory at 21 times, more or less 12-month forward earnings, which would be now close to the March 22 earnings. If we ignored for a minute the P's, again, because they are getting distorted due to the effect of the pandemic, and we look at the price to book, The answer again is very straightforward. The Nifty 50 has moved into expensive territory. You can see there the price to book at 3.4, certainly indicating a territory which is rich for the Nifty 50. Return on equity currently very depressed. But given that we are expecting 30% earnings growth, or at least the forecast is for 30% earnings growth in FY22, and then again 18%, I would expect the ROE to pull up to about 14 to 15% if the consensus numbers were to come true over a 2-year period. How do price to book valuations look for the mid cap and the small cap segment of the market? So you can look at that over here. On the left-hand side is the mid-cap trailing price to book, and on the right side, the Nifty small-cap price to book. These mid-cap index gap to the large cap is more or less eroded, even though it has not yet entered its own historical territory of being expensive. As far as small caps are concerned, still at a discount to the large caps, which is frankly quite logical when you think about it at an aggregate basis, but relative to its own history, it has now pushed into expensive territory. So we are faced with a situation now when we look at the top-down index valuations, clearly we have moved into expensive territory. Having said that, as portfolio managers, when we drill down at a sector level and a stock level, there are, of course, still some opportunities left. But the big message from an asset allocation point of view, certainly at these levels, is to indicate a cautious approach given where valuations have now reached. Moving on, not much value here. So what we wanted to do today is actually spend some time talking about CapEx, right? So we've got the valuations out of the way. Let's think about CapEx in India. And obviously there was a lot of discussion which took place, particularly because of the budget numbers about, CapEx trends in India and whether the economy can now experience a potential surge in capital expenditure. So to do this, we first need to understand what is the breakup of capital expenditure in India. When you look at it that way, what you will see is that the government accounts only for a quarter of total capital investment in India. The balance, 76%, is more or less equally divided between what we call households and what we call the corporate capex sector. One caveat here, when we use the word household, this includes unincorporated private businesses. So, the shopkeeper down the road because he's running the business in his own name, or a small scale entrepreneur who's running a sole proprietorship, a small manufacturing unit perhaps, or a restaurant in his own name. These get counted as household because they are not incorporated companies. So when we say household in India, it does include households like my own household or your household, but it also includes these small enterprises which are unincorporated. But it's really corporates and households who dominate capex. It is not government capex which dominates. And within this, we can divide it into two components. In corporates, there is capex which is done by companies which operate in tradable sectors. What do we mean by tradables? So companies that produce things which can be traded, for example, companies that produce automobiles or pharmaceuticals, these are what we call traded commodities. So those companies are 14%. 25% is actually the non-tradable segment of corporate capex. What does this relate to? When we say tradable, we mean across borders. So, when a telecom company makes investments in India, or let's say an internet company creates a payment infrastructure in India, these are non-tradables. They are used only within the borders of India, and therefore they are called non-tradables. So these two segments dominate, and in households, a significant portion of capex is actually real estate. The house that you might build or I might buy, or a small factory or a small restaurant built by a private individual, all of that gets counted as the real estate component of household capex. And then there is other household capex, which includes maybe your purchase of other capital assets. So that is the breakup. So this is how total capital expenditure in India is structured. Now let's look at what has been the cause of the slowdown over the last decade. So you look at the left-hand side, and the purple bar shows you the growth in capex between 2002 and 2012. These were remarkable years for capital expenditure in India. And then the yellow bars show you the growth in capex between FY12 and FY19, when we know that capex has been subdued. Now, total capex, which was growing at 17%, decelerated to 9%. As we know, government has been spending on different elements, particularly roads, railways, etc. So government spending has decelerated, but not very dramatically, from 15% a year to 11% a year. The dramatic deceleration has been in corporate capex, which has dropped from 24% to 10% because companies have become risk averse. Many went bankrupt. The financial system was unwilling to lend to them. And the other drop in capex happened in households, where it dropped from 14% to 7% growth. Now, when you look at the right side, it is further broken up to give you a comparison relative to nominal GDP growth during the period FY12 to FY19. The two weakest components are household real estate capex. People have not been buying houses or investing in real estate. This is very well known. Obviously, the biggest blow has come after 2016-17, I would say, but the slowdown actually started in 2012. So household real estate investments have grown at only 4% during the 7-year period. And the other weak element of corporate capex has been the investment in tradables. So companies setting up capacity to manufacture steel or pharmaceuticals or all those kinds of things which can be traded. Now, this is where the government policy in terms of PLI, which is the production linked incentive, which is being made available to companies to set up capacities for exports or for import substitution, can perhaps make a slight improvement in the outcome over the next few years. Along with that, the current extremely low real interest rates, you can get a housing loan at 6.7%. The worst of the RERA-related supply side issues in real estate are now behind us. There is some reason to believe that even real estate could start to improve from here. So those are the two weakest links, and this is where we hope to see improvement going ahead. What will lift corporate tradable capex? I talked about PLI, but very simply, if you see a pickup in world trade, it is very likely that manufacturing capex will follow. On the left-hand side, the blue line shows you world trade volume, and the green line shows you India's manufacturing capex. And as you can see, the two tend to go hand in hand. Why should we be bullish about world trade volume? One reason is that the US, given its large fiscal deficit, is likely to convert into a large current account deficit. This is just the way economics works, and that might be a source of driver for world trade in the next year or two. The global reflation that we are seeing also tends to have a positive impact on India's manufacturing capex. What does reflation mean? Essentially a rising trend in prices of manufactured goods, which again is something that we are seeing with commodity-based inflation gradually seeping into the entire manufacturing system. So this again is one reason to be slightly optimistic that corporate capex is likely to improve in the tradable segment. And that's important because remember, that was the weak segment. As far as corporate services, the non-tradable capex is concerned, that might have to wait. Why? For a very simple reason. The big growth during FY12 to 19 came in telecom, right? And we know that that big capex is now well behind us. The second big element of capex in non-tradable was in commercial real estate. But because of the pandemic and the work from home, it's slightly difficult to be optimistic about the growth in commercial real estate demand going ahead. So it is likely that the tradable capex may go up, but the non-tradable corporate services capex might be a little slow in the next few years. Finally, when it comes to government capex, the right way to think about it is on the left-hand side. There is defense capex, there is central government capex. Excluding defense, there is capex done by PSUs, and finally there is capex done by state governments. So the two dominant elements of capex are PSUs and state government. The PSUs, when you look at the right side, have been investing slightly more aggressively than the 2002 to 2012 period, but the state governments have been far more sluggish. And given the challenges currently in terms of GST revenue, it is still difficult to see the state governments picking up their spending on capex aggressively. Remember, they are not earning the total amount of revenue that they were expecting, and the central government is actually compensating them for the GST shortfall. So yes, while the central government is increasing its capex, it is a small player in that overall pie chart, as you can see on the left-hand side, and the key really lies with the state governments. The good news, however, is that remember, GST collections in India are now growing at almost close to positive double-digit levels. If this trend were to continue because of the formalization that's taken place in the economy, then maybe 1 to 2 years out, the tables might turn. State governments might find their revenues to be buoyant, and that could eventually help them come to the capex party. But at this point of time, it is still work in progress. So this is broadly some of the thoughts we wanted to share on CapEx. Just to sum it up again, it's the corporate tradable segment and household real estate which have been weak. Given government schemes like PLI, the positive global tailwinds for global trade, the capex in the tradable segment might go up, and the record low interest rates and the cleanup of RERA, which is now behind us, might give some momentum to real estate as well. But we'll have to wait and see for state government capex to become a significant contributor. Another story in recent days has been that of the bond yield spike, right? So when you look across the world, the rates of interest on government bonds has gone up dramatically. So what you have on this slide is the change in the 10-year government yield compared to the start of the year, which is December 31st, 2020, and what's happened literally over the last, about 60 days or so. As you can see, across the board, there has been a big jump up in yields. In India, actually, we are somewhere in the middle, only about a 37 basis point increase in yields. The US has actually seen a 34 basis point increase in yields. And remember, their bond yield is only about 1.3% before the spike happened. So it went up from almost 1.25 to 1.6%. So a pretty big jump in yields over there. So bond yields have spiked all over the world, and this is creating some nervousness about what is going on and whether you will start to see central banks pull back on the liquidity support that they have been giving markets. But I think the right way to think about this is that it was essential for central banks to provide liquidity support when there was no visibility of a cure for COVID. We didn't know how long the pain will last. We didn't know when we could go back to life as normal. Now, what we are seeing is that across the board, in countries across the world, there is a declining trend in the infection rate. There is a pickup in vaccinations, and all the economic data is pointing towards a gradual recovery in trend. So it is actually a given that central banks will have to or will decide to gradually halt the extent of support. What is important is whether they actually reverse policy. Some amount of an increase in yields is only a demonstration of confidence by the markets that they now expect growth to go up. And what we have on this next slide is just to show you once again the US 10-year bond yield spike, which has happened in real terms, and how that has been sort of troubling the markets. And on the right-hand side, as that bond yield has spiked, you have seen emerging market currencies start to come under pressure. If you remember, for the last 1 year, we've kept talking about this, that the support provided by the US Federal Reserve has meant the dollar stayed weak. Most major central banks have kept their currencies weak by providing large amount of supply, and that has been good for EMs. Now we are seeing a little bit of nervousness. At this point of time, we believe that this nervousness is the typical nervousness that you would expect to see in markets during, let's say, a relay race, where initially the central bank does the running by providing liquidity support. But as the economy starts to revive, it passes the baton to the economy and to entrepreneurs who will be able to absorb the higher rates simply because now they are looking at a positive growth environment. But this is always a nervous time for markets, and that is what we'd like to highlight here. There is nervousness in the bond markets. The baton passes from monetary support, weak growth, to an improvement in growth and normalizing rates. We would worry about the outcomes only when the Fed explicitly starts to pull back on liquidity. I think at this point of time, they've clearly indicated that they are very far away from that stance, but be that as it may, markets always get nervous when the baton is passing. And anybody who's been an athlete in life knows that when you're running a relay race and you have to pass the baton to the next runner, there is always that bit of nervousness which happens. So that's something which the markets are struggling with right now. We've already talked about the valuations, which are in expensive zone now. There is risk on account of these valuations, and markets are vulnerable to any sharp shifts in global liquidity and inflation. As I said, in India, the correction has not been deep, but when you look at, let's say, the US markets, particularly the technology heavy component, the NASDAQ, as I said, was down 10% at one point this week, and the Chinese technology market down almost 20%. Good news in India, the CPI is now well within the comfort zone of the RBI, and the RBI has reiterated that it will stay accommodative. It still sees that there is an output gap in the economy, which means that companies and industries are operating well below their full capacity level. And just to conclude, as we've been saying before, earnings have surprised. The forecasts have started to push higher. And we believe, just like in crises that we have seen in the past, whenever there is a challenging period, the companies that navigate that challenging period very well are very often likely to gain market share, they accelerate their growth, and they're also able to improve profitability in the subsequent period because they face less competition. And that appears to be the kind of environment that we are currently experiencing. So that in a summary is, the broad thoughts that we wanted to share with you on valuation, on the nervousness in the bond market, and finally, where we stand in terms of the CapEx cycle. So with that, I'm going to halt sharing the presentation, and I'll just stop that now. And we're now going to go into the Q&A session. Once again, thank you. Many of you have already sent in your questions. My colleague Niranjan from the product team will be joining me on this call, and he'll be taking the questions that have already been received. And feel free to continue sending in your questions. We have about half an hour left, and we'll be quite happy to address any further questions that come in. So I'll pause over here, and Niranjan, over to you with the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Vetri. As you speak, in fact, we are already getting a lot of questions today. But as a reminder, participants, you can, whatever the questions you have to Vetri, you can post it on the comment box. So we will try to take them. Vetri, so the first question to you, it is actually coming from persons who are joined today, like Ramesh, Naskar, Amit, and Avinash. So the question is like this: the stock markets are up and gaining momentum, but there is volatility as well. So what are your expectations for the next few quarters?
Sure. I would say that volatility is part and parcel of equity markets. In my 25 years in the equity market, I say that volatility is a given. We have to differentiate while investing between two issues. One is the mark-to-market fluctuations that take place in stock prices. And second, the permanent loss of capital or destruction of capital, which happens because business enterprises go bankrupt. I think anybody who enters the stock market cannot avoid the first risk, which means that at some point of time, you are going to see quotational losses on the stocks, or in our perspective, the mutual funds that you own in your portfolio. But there is a very simple way to navigate that volatility, and that is why every investor or advisor needs to have a asset allocation process where you balance your portfolio using certain methodologies, maybe valuations, maybe other factors, to determine how you would like to allocate between asset classes to manage that volatility. But you cannot exclude that volatility. And I'll give you a very simple example. During the biggest part of the bull run that I have seen in my career, from the low point of 2003 April to December 2007, so about 4 years, roughly the BSE Sensex went up by about 7 times during that period. It went up from 3,000 to 21,000. Now, that sounds too good to be true. In a 4-year period, stock prices go up 7x. But what I would like to remind you is that during that period, there were times where the market fell 30%. In fact, it fell more than 30% twice. It fell more than 20% 3 times. And I lose count of how many times it fell 10% during that 4-year period. So I think if we are going to define volatility as falling prices, you must accept them as part of your investment journey. It is only asset allocation which can help you navigate that volatility. There is no such thing as a market going up 3 times, 5 times, 10 times over 10 years without having those falls that will keep coming to shake you out. The markets will always have that volatility. As far as the risk of permanent loss of capital is concerned, which is companies which go to zero in terms of their stock price, that is why we as fund managers have a research team. We have a well-established research process where we review our investments. Certainly, some of them will go wrong, but we very rarely see investments where we lose 90% or 100% of the value that we have invested in the companies. So we can take care of the permanent loss of capital by selecting companies. At UTI, we have a well-established process which looks at metrics like return on capital, look at cash flow generation that the company generates. And I would submit that a well-diversified portfolio like we have at UTI, which incorporates these two factors, cannot go bankrupt overnight. Individual companies can go bankrupt, but companies that meet these two tests and are run as part of a diversified portfolio cannot go bankrupt. So we need to distinguish between mark-to-market volatility that cannot be avoided. You must accept it as part of the cost of the returns that you hope to get in equity, but permanent loss of capital can be avoided by having a strong investment process, and I believe we have demonstrated that.
Thanks, Vetri. The next question is on bond yield per se. Again, this is coming from participants like Avinash Kumar and Kansal. So the question is like this. India's bond yields are mirroring global trends. However, the rise in government and corporate bond yields in India seems to be ahead of the growth cycle. So if global bond yields do continue to move up and dollar also firms up along with that, so does it pose a risk to India's economic recovery? So if yes, please elaborate on this.
Sure. So I think that's a fabulous question, and I'll give you both a background of history as well as how to think about it. What is important at every point of time is whether the growth of companies is exceeding the cost of debt that they are able to raise in the market. Very simply, as long as that is the case, rising rates do not pose a threat to the market. It is only when the rise in rates exceeds the rate of growth of enterprises that it becomes a challenge for them in terms of the cost of borrowing. And as I said in my earlier section, there is always a passing of the baton which has to happen. See, extreme risk scenarios like what happened last year call for a central bank to provide more liquidity than required just to make sure that we avoid the worst case outcome. Now, when we see that across a host of metrics, whether it is GST collections, whether it is automobile sales, whether it is power sales, whether it is the sales of cement, and a host of indicators. Clearly, we are in positive territory year on year. So you cannot keep the policy setting at minimum level when the temperature itself of the economy is starting to improve. The increase in yields that we are seeing now, to my mind, actually demonstrate increased confidence in the recovery prospects of the economy. Then I said, I'll also give you a historical context. The historical context is that the point in time where we saw the lowest yields for the 10-year bond in India date back to early 2002, right? When the 10-year bond yield went to 5%. From that low point, the 10-year bond yield went up all the way to 9% over the next almost 5 or 6 years. During this period, the equity market had the bull run of its lifetime. So the reality is that there was a period in India when we had the biggest bull run of our lifetimes, when bond yields actually continued to go up over a 5 to 6 year period, but stock prices were also going up. Why did that happen? It happened for what I said earlier. When the growth prospects of companies are improving and they are able to absorb the higher cost of debt, simply because their growth and the growth opportunities are paying for it, then it does not become a binding constraint either on the company or therefore on the prospects of the market. So when you go back in history and see, you will normally see there is a sweet spot. During that period, bond rates can continue to go up, but because the economic prospects are improving and companies are growing even faster, the economy can and the stock market can absorb higher borrowing costs. There will, however, come a point at some point where the central bank perhaps gets very aggressive in its attempts to, control inflation, or it wants to rein in growth because it believes there is no output gap left. That is the point in time where the sharp increases in the cost of debt with a direct policy objective of pushing down growth, that is when it has a negative impact on equities. But there is a period in the middle where actually both can work together, meaning you can have rising rates and you can have a rising stock prices, because the economic prospects and growth prospects of the business more than absorb the higher cost of borrowing. And that's what we have seen in the past as well.
Sure, Vetri. That was aptly put. Thanks for that. The next question is on stock markets. So back there. So the question is like this. Lately, there is a debate going in terms of old versus the new economy stocks. So can you tell us more about it? And what is your view on this old versus new debate, especially from India perspective?
Sure. So, I think this goes back to the kind of environment that we've experienced in some senses globally, as well as in India, which is to say that the growth businesses have been more in the technology space, and the real world businesses have actually struggled. Particularly the commodity businesses, the industrial businesses, because that part of the economy has not really been in very good shape. So neither have they had strong growth for industrials, neither have they had the benefit of pricing power or commodity price inflation, because these factors were missing. I think what we are seeing now is that when the pandemic initially hit, and I would say all the way up to maybe December of 2020, actually the world was looking at the fact that these technology-led businesses were able to lead us out of the pandemic, and they were finding new ways to contribute to our life in a way that was very profitable to them, and the stock market was continuously re-rating them. Now, however, we have reached a phase where people are realizing that these large policy interventions by central banks and governments are also giving the real world economy a boost. Particularly the weak dollar has had its impact in terms of sending capital out of the US into emerging markets, and also feeding the strength that we've seen in commodity prices. So this has created some kind of a rotation, as we are seeing, from technology. And I talked earlier in this session about the sharp fall in the NASDAQ, the Chinese technology companies, and perhaps there has been some capital rotation into these cyclical areas, commodities, industrials, and so on and so forth. Plus, of course, increasingly there is a trade where money is going into some of the consumer discretionary cyclicals where money had where the stocks had done very, very poorly last year because of the pandemic, right? So nobody was going to restaurants, nobody was, getting on an airplane easily. There were no marriages, so therefore perhaps people were not buying the kind of fine clothes and jewelry that they would typically wear to a wedding. And now we are seeing a bit of lift come back in those cyclical discretionary businesses because we have the visibility of a vaccine. And there is a belief that, people, when they are allowed to now get back on a flight, when they're allowed to meet in large numbers, would like to do it because they've missed out on it for the last 1 year. So this is really the transition we are talking about, which is from that technology-led business model that was leading us out of the pandemic to a sort of reversion to mean, where the commodity, industrials, consumer discretionary are seeing a second life as people look to life beyond the lockdown. I will only say this much, that these are the normal cycles which play out in the market, and the market continuously keeps changing its mood every now and then. Beyond a point, it is virtually impossible to understand or predict how those moods will change. What I believe is more important is to be in those businesses that have demonstrated their ability to navigate a difficult time and participate in the growth upside when that growth opportunity comes by. And to my mind, it is picking those right companies which over time helps us create alpha in our portfolios rather than continuously trying to jump from one trend to the other. Because trying to jump from one trend to the other is a little bit like a dog trying to catch its own tail, and you might always find yourself a little bit late to the party. But yes, the focus of markets is now towards which are those real world businesses which will benefit. And maybe that is the term that, the person who asked the question had when he talked about the old businesses. But, in a sense, the market is always a relay race. Like I said earlier, and don't be surprised if at some point in time in the future, you again see the relay race start to show a different set of short-term winners. But as I said, longer term, what we have seen over time is that it is the stock selection which creates alpha for you very, very significantly.
Thanks, Vetri, for that detailed clarity. So that was, in fact, insightful. In your deliberation, you had mentioned that household capex is a laggard over the last decade due to the inadequate fiscal transfers and not so easy financing, etc. So what are the likely drivers, do you think, which can bolster the recovery in household capex going forward?
A good question. Actually, I would just parse that question slightly, Niranjan, to say that in the last, this is actually 2012 to 2019, that 7-year period, household capex has slowed. And to my mind, this reflects two things. One is very clearly real estate. The boom in real estate actually continued even after the GFC, but it really started to run out of steam somewhere by about 2014, 2015. And then post 2014, 15, as we got to an environment, remember in 2013, when we had the currency crisis, the interest rates had shot up dramatically in India, correct? That happened in August, October of 2013. So this sharp rise in interest rates transmitted to the demand for real estate, and we saw a very significant slowdown kick in by 2014. Then, of course, you got demonetization, you got RERA, very significant crackdown by the government on black money and real estate. So many of these things actually caused the spending on real estate to go down dramatically. Why do we think things might improve from here? Very simple. All the data still indicates that there is a shortfall of housing supply in India relative to demand. Second, you have record low interest rates available for a mortgage. Today the top financial institutions in the country are offering mortgages at 6.6, 6.7%. In my 25 years, I have never heard of these kind of rates being offered for mortgages. Third thing, what's happened is that governments are also waking up to this reality. And we have seen in Maharashtra, in Karnataka, in Delhi, they have actually cut stamp duties to try and incentivize real estate demand. That has worked. We have seen quite a bit of pickup in property sales. So that is also cleaning the inventory pipeline. And finally, from the supply side, there was a time in India where, to put it mildly, everybody and his uncle could become a real estate developer. Today, because of RERA, I believe the supply side is now in the hands once again of only more organized, well-established players who can follow the RERA guidelines and who have access to financing from the banks and financial institutions. So I think the whole sector is much better poised. Supply is more tightly controlled because of rules and regulations. Demand incentivized because of these reductions in stamp duties, and understanding and appreciation by governments that you cannot tax the hell out of real estate, and finally these record low interest rates. That gives me some confidence in real estate household capex starting to pick up. As far as aggregate household capex is concerned, to the extent, Niranjan, that unincorporated businesses are part of household capex, I would tend to be a little bit cautious, because when we talk about these winds of formalization in the Indian economy, demonetization, GST transition, NBFC related credit crisis because they pulled back on credit supply, there has been a definite damage to small sized businesses operating in the informal sector. So I'm a little bit more skeptical about a significant pickup in unincorporated businesses capex. But household real estate capex, I think there is reason to believe that it will look up from there.
Sure, Vetri, thank you. The next one goes like this. Privatizing more PSUs is once again the flavor of the season. But according to you, what are the limitations to this push? Do you think the businesses will be in a position to command a premium and gain further market share?
So, interesting question, Niranjan. I think we can look back at history. When we look back at history, what do we see? We have seen examples, the privatizations which happened in 2002, 2003. Many of these privatizations where a public sector asset was sold in an auction, somebody in the private sector bought it, and they were able to create tremendous value by putting to use that asset in much, much better fashion, right? And you're familiar with those names and stock prices which did remarkably after being privatized. Then we can also see the experience of recent years where, for example, the government was trying to privatize Air India, and the first attempt was a failure because the liabilities were still accruing to the buyer. They were concerned about the employee costs that they would have to carry going forward. But now when we see government talk about privatization, I think what is very welcome is that they have completely come to understand that all the assets and the potential liabilities of the enterprises that they are trying to privatize prior to the date of privatization will need to be absorbed by Government of India. That is the only way to incentivize the private sector to come in and take over the business. So now that they have acknowledged and understood that this privatization template is the only one which works, and you can see that in the new template that they have put out for Air India, whereby all the liabilities are being absorbed by Government of India, and the buyer will only have to worry about how to manage the enterprise on a forward basis. So I think this realization that they have makes me a little bit more optimistic that now there is room and there is likelihood of some bidders emerging for some of these public sector assets. But once again, they will ask for Government of India to absorb all liabilities related to employees for previous periods, any other liabilities for previous periods to be absorbed by Government of India, and they will only take a forward risk on those enterprises in a way that any private entrepreneur would try to allocate capital. As a taxpayer, Niranjan, and I think this is equally important, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that when Government of India has bailed out enterprises like, the amount of money they have put into Air India, the amount of money they have provided lakhs of crores to recapitalize public sector banks, the advantage of privatization is twofold. Not only Government of India may realize some money for the enterprises it sells, but I'm saying let's presume they don't even receive too much money for the enterprises they sell. At least future liabilities on account of these enterprises will not accrue to the exchequer and therefore indirectly to you and me as taxpayers, right? So, if the number of PSU banks was more than 20, we're down to 13. and Government of India says we'll eventually be down to 4, everything else can get privatized, then the recapitalization liabilities that accrue to Government of India and on the taxpayer will also be so much more limited than what they used to be in the past. So that also, I believe, is a very positive outcome for all of us as taxpayers.
Thanks, Vetri. So before I take up questions on sectors and funds, one question from MFD, Mr. Sriram. So his question is the economic recovery going to replicate the phenomenal recovery like after the Spanish flu ending with the Great Depression? That is the question, yeah.
I mean, interesting question, but I must admit that I think the outcomes are going to be very different across geographies, very simply because the impact of the virus also, as it appears, and I cross my fingers when I say this, has been very different across geographies. The impact in countries like India, even in terms of deaths, even though every death is painful, when you look at the statistics, the death rate in India has not been so acute. The setback in some other economies has been far more acute. The period of the shutdown, the loss of income has perhaps been far more acute. And therefore, I think we cannot generalize, but the impact of the Spanish flu, as people said, is that when they came back to life as normal, people had, particularly those who had the money, were of the sort of view that if I have the money, better that I enjoy myself, because who knows what might happen in the future, having just experienced that pandemic, right? And I think all of us perhaps have the same feeling now that in the last 1 year, our social interaction, our ability to travel, go out, all of that has been so tightly compromised that those of us who are fortunate and privileged enough to either have a secure savings nest or have been assured of some level of income security. We've not been insecure on the income front. Perhaps as things normalize, there will be a willingness to be more aggressive with the spending, simply because we want to get a sense of how life might be, how life was in the past. Also, you don't want to delay gratification, right? Because who knows what happens 1 year later if some other flu comes again. So when I have the opportunity, I want to be able to enjoy what I can with the spending power that is available at my disposal. So some people have coined the term revenge spending, that now that I have an opportunity, I'm going to go out there and spend. But I think these will be a lot more localized. These may happen only in certain sections of the population, and therefore even the beneficiaries may be in certain sections of products and services. And it won't surprise me if this sort of revenge spending is more visible in premium, luxury, lifestyle, experiential goods and services rather than in the base level of products. Because without doubt, there is a large cross-section of the population in India in the unorganized informal sector who is continuing to suffer as a result of the pandemic. And therefore, the impact that they're experiencing may continue to show up in the goods and services consumed at the lower end of the economic strata. But at the middle to higher end, you may see some elements of discretionary spending revival, disproportionately revival.
Thanks, Vetri. Couple of questions on sectors. The first one is like this. The metal and IT are the two big winners over the last 1 year period. So what do you see as a key driver or the detractors going forward for these two sectors?
Right. So I think in the Indian context, when we think about IT, which is where I think the question is coming from, remember that in the Indian context, our IT companies are, first of all, we are not really talking internet technology. We have one or two companies, but really the bulk of our IT sector is traditional B2B corporate IT service providers, right? The Infosys, Wipro, TCS, HCL Tech, so on and so forth. They're not consumer facing, they are B2B offshore based service providers. I think they will continue to perhaps see strong tailwinds. That is what they are telling us in all our conversations, that they are seeing strong tailwinds because the pandemic is causing their clients to accelerate their spending on going digital. We've already been talking about this for a while, that digital, and if you see most of the companies, many of the companies, They disclose the percentage of revenue they get from what they call digital services. And remember, this has been the fastest growing part of their business, even as their legacy businesses have decelerated. So I think as far as IT services are concerned, certainly there is some signs we see that they have entered a era of perhaps stronger cyclical growth as compared to the previous 5 or 6 years. Margins, dramatic expansion, but some of that is simply because their people could not travel. But as when we were talking to some of the IT companies, they said that all the hard work that we did in terms of being in front of the customer for 10 years benefited us during this 1 year where we couldn't travel. But it would be foolish to believe that everything can be done without traveling and once in a while getting in front of the customer. So I think the margin gains will certainly have to be given back over a period of time, but the outlook for volume growth remains positive. And certainly there are hopes that you are entering a new short upcycle in technology spending. Metals, very simply a reflection of supply side disruptions, where the whole supply chain has been disrupted because of the pandemic. And secondly, the strong rise in prices is obviously creating strong cash flow for these companies. And remember, most metal companies, if you go back or even if you see their balance sheets today, they all operate at very high debt to equity ratios. The minimum debt equity ratios, like except for some of the public sector companies, typically it is well above 1.5. In fact, their debt to EBITDA ranges are anywhere between 2.5 to 4 times debt to EBITDA. So for them, this rise in prices is fantastic because they are generating massive cash flow. They are paying down the debt, and the debt that they pay down creates value for the equity shareholders. I think the challenge in these commodity companies, particularly the metals, is going to be how sustainable is the upturn in demand, or is it simply a mere restocking exercise? I think on that front, the jury is still out as to once we are beyond the restocking cycle, how sustainable is the upturn in demand. IT services, I would tend to believe, certainly, if not structural, there is a mid-cycle uptick in growth rates. I think that is something that we have slightly greater confidence in. But, everything comes with a risk.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Thanks, Ritti. The next one is on banking sector and banking fund. Do you think more consolidation is in cards for India's banking sector? And do you think the bigger story is still intact? Is it still a good buy, especially if there are dips in a banking fund?
So, let me answer this as a fund manager, and the strategies that at least I am involved with, value opportunities in particular. We still think this is one sector where there is some degree of valuation comfort in some of the names. I'm generalizing, not necessarily in every single name, but in some of the names there is fair degree of comfort. Why? They have already provided for potential loan losses from COVID. They have already raised capital, and secondly, for the reason you mentioned, Niranjan, which is consolidation, we think that there are a handful of financial institutions, maybe 6 or 7 banks, 2, 3 NBFCs, which have the ability to significantly outgrow industry over the next 2 to 3 years. So if the economy tends to revive and credit demand comes back, they will actually get disproportionate credit growth. So you could actually get a positive upcycle driven both by higher credit growth and lower credit cost. So we would tend to remain reasonably positive on financials as a sector. But within that, particularly on these handful of institutions, which we think are going to emerge as the market share gainers within the financial sector over the next few years.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. So the next one is actually coming from Mr. Sajal Kumar. So with the recent rally in the equity markets, are there any sectoral funds that you see as viable investment option from a tactical investment point of view?
So I normally like to look at sectors only when they are beaten up and completely battered and bruised. There is not too much which frankly stands out at that point of time, at this point of time, because when you look at it now on a 6-month, 1 year basis, everything has sort of recovered. But again, just from, and I'm talking again now more from my own perspective, the Value Opportunities Fund, we still think that in financials and in the larger healthcare pharmaceutical space, we are still in the middle of the cycle. We don't think we are at the end of the cycle, both in the potential for earnings growth as well as in terms of where the valuations could move to. But it's not really a short-term tactical view. It's more a structural view that you are in the mid-cycle, both in pharmaceuticals as well as in banking.
Thanks, Vetri. I know we are actually almost hitting the time, but a couple of questions before we wrap up. How does valuations and earnings projection look now for small caps after this big rally? I mean, especially in the last 6 months.
So, I make the same point on small caps as I did when we had launched our small cap fund. I think in small cap, strategies, what is more important is the company that you are backing rather than the top-down numbers. For a variety of reasons, not too many of these companies are covered. So, there's no real consensus numbers which are available from that point of view. Small caps will benefit from low cost of capital and abundant availability of capital. But I would always say that investment in small caps is more a bottom-up approach and not really a top-down approach driven by valuations or top-down earnings considerations, because they are a lot more affected both by the positivity in the cycle as well as by risks and negativity in the cycle. So, I would say those are not the material elements that we would look at for investing in small caps. Small caps are always about bottom-up investment arguments.
Thanks, Vetri. There is one question specific to FlexiCap fund. The question is like this: the fund has about 55 stocks in your portfolio and no big bets. The highest weight is about like 6%. However, the fund is consistent in its alpha generation despite of not having concentrated exposure. So, can you tell us more about the strategy adopted by the fund manager?
Sure. So I've repeated this before. I'll say it again. There is nothing which indicates to us when we look at the data over long periods of time that concentration necessarily results in better outcomes. It has higher risk and it could have higher outcomes as well. But sometimes people don't realize this. A lot of people will talk about Peter Lynch, who ran the Magellan Fund at Fidelity, and legendary fund manager. I'm sure many have read his book, One Up on Wall Street, Beating the Street. But the most unusual thing that people are not aware about his strategy is at different points of time, he owned as many as 1,500 companies in his portfolio. So I think it is a misconception that you have to have a concentrated portfolio to win. Of course, when you look at great wealth which has been created, let's say the wealth created by a Mr. Ambani or a Mr. Uday Kotak, it comes from owning one stock. But equally, there are other entrepreneurs, I won't take their name, who owned all their wealth in one company, the company they owned. And remember, those companies have gone bankrupt. So concentration is a great strategy for creating abnormal wealth as well as for losing abnormal wealth. I think if we are in the game of enabling people to achieve their financial goals, a diversified portfolio is a far superior approach. How have we managed the same in UTI FlexiCap fund to create an alpha consistently? I think there are two things, and your question itself has an answer. One, the diversification allows us to be more consistent. B, when you talk about a fund, what we believe is more important is not the number of companies in the fund, but what is the active share of the fund. The active share of the fund, we publish this in our Ready Reckoner every month, is how different is your fund from the benchmark. And the active share of UTI FlexiCap fund is typically in the region of about 63-65%, which tells you that the fund manager is willing to and taking a lot of risk relative to the benchmark. That is a significant amount of distinguishing risk that he's taking relative to the benchmark. And that is what we believe enables him to consistently create that alpha. The diversification helps the consistency, and the 63% active share tells you that it is not a benchmark hedging strategy. So the right thing to think about is not concentration versus diversification, it is benchmark hugging and non-benchmark hugging. How do you determine benchmark hugging versus non-benchmark hugging? You look at active share. A 63-65% active share is a significant conviction-driven investing style.
Thanks, Vetri. One last question. This is coming repetitively. One of the participant, Nambiar, is also asking. Of course, the question is on gold. So, can you tell us what does the recent correction in gold price mean for investor? Is it a short-term correction, and does it offer a window of opportunity?
So, unfortunately, I can't throw much light on that. I've always held the view that gold has a place in the investment portfolio, but it has a place in the portfolio as an insurance or a hedge type asset. And believe me, it has done exactly that. When the world was going to pieces 1 year ago, the only part of your portfolio which was actually starting to gallop and did very, very well was gold, right? So it did exactly what you wanted. When the rest of your portfolio was under stress, here was that insurance asset in your portfolio which was giving you a rise in value. Now, when the world has a lot more confidence in growth, the vaccine, and nobody is so uncertain about the future anymore, obviously gold has started to take a backseat. But as I said, if you think about it as an insurance and as a hedge asset, I think it still has place in a portfolio. But if it's coming down in value, it's balanced against the fact that the equity values in your portfolio have gone up. So think about it in that context rather than at a absolute concept of when should I buy and when should I sell. At which I will admit I'm not an expert either in the stock market on when to buy and when to sell, or for that matter in gold, and certainly not in gold.
Thanks, Vetri. We have hit that time, so back to you.
Sure, great. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for all the questions that you all have sent in. It's wonderful to be able to address your queries. It makes the session also so much more interesting. We look forward to being with you again next month in April, typically around the 10th of the month. Till then, stay safe. Get yourself vaccinated. If you can, take your elders, take your parents to the vaccination centers. That's the best way to help this economy gets back on its feet and get our own peace of mind that we are doing the right thing and, ensuring that we all stay healthy. And, that's the best that we can hope for. So thank you so much and have a great evening.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.